Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Mashing Out with the Beer Fairy on Craft Beer Nation. I'm Ashley Bauer, the Beer Fairy, and I'm here with my friends, Randy Garner Jr., Alan Huerta, Gil Miller, and that's it for tonight. We've got a couple more people that are potentially coming, but they're not here yet. So before we mash in, I want to mention that you can find our blog on craftbeernation.org, watch our weekly hangouts on YouTube, listen to our podcast on Stitcher, iTunes, Podcatcher, and FeedBurner, and join us in our Google Plus community on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Now, let's mash in. So tonight, we're going to talk about fermentation temperatures. You guys have been brewing for a while, some of you. What sort of fermentation temperatures or devices are you using to control your fermentation temperature?
I rely on the constant temperature of my little sump pump room. That's all I got. I haven't gotten to the point where I can control my temperature yet the way I wanted to.
That's
Unfortunately,
reasonable.
yeah. I kind of, yeah.
It's understandable.
I understand.
No, we've all been there.
I have an AC unit. I've got a unit in here, and this room I'm in is actually, whenever I'm brewing beer, which I'm not right now, is my fermentation chamber. It's about, I don't know, maybe 150 square feet, 200 square foot room in the middle of my house, except for the one exterior wall that the window unit faces out on. It's kind of nice.
So you actually use a window unit in there. So how cold are you able to get it with the window unit?
It goes down to 65 degrees.
Okay.
Yeah, which is good for the majority of the kind of beers I'd want to brew anyway.
I know my wife isn't about to let me do that, so lucky you.
It took about 6 months, but we got there.
Okay.
But it depends on the beer you're making too, right?
Definitely. Tonight's focus is going to be on ales. Lagering is a whole nother level that I enjoy and would love to talk about, but I think that for the majority of brewers, especially starting out, they're going to want to talk about ales. So tonight we're going to talk about ale temperatures.
Gil, what do you use to control your fermentation, or do you not control it?
Well, it depends. My basement have this area here. It's pretty steady. The temperature doesn't rise much. I do have a refrigerator that I can feed my carb oil if I need it. I have to get an external thermostat or a thermometer so I can get the temperature right because my refrigerator doesn't really do a great job. But yeah, it makes cool enough. I never did a logger, so I'm not sure if it gets cold enough to get a logger because it's not working that well. But yeah. I normally don't have to. The basement is cool enough.
Yeah, I should point out that the room where I do my fermentation, that it's also in the basement as well. So that's about as consistent of a temperature as I can get in my house as well.
What about you, Alan?
So what I use is a chest freezer that's relatively big, and I have a two-stage temperature controller. One to control the cooling from for the freezer that's initially came intact with it. And then I installed some reptile, the heater pads, when people have reptiles, snakes, lizards, whatever, that I just put on the bottom of their cage to keep it heated. I use that to control keep the temperatures constant between the cold and the hot.
So it's like an insulation pads, or?
It's like a kind of like a clear film, if you will, and it has black stripes across it.
Okay.
And the black stripes have heating elements in them.
Oh!
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So that's what I use to hold my temperatures.
So, like I mentioned before, I was thinking we'd focus on ale temperatures tonight simply because lagering does add a little bit more complexity. And whenever someone gets a new homebrew kit, let's say the first-time homebrewer gets a Mr. Beer kit and brings it home, hopefully it's not a lager because that would be a lot to jump into. I think most of them are ales. So after we talked about cleaning and sanitation last week, and we're all done with that and feel pretty confident about our sanitation practices and that we've killed all the bugs and wild yeast floating around in the air, it's important to think about how we're going to maintain the fermentation temperature. As we've all talked about here, we have our own methods and whatnot. I guess we'll start with you, Randy, since you don't have any one of the particular devices. You said right now you're just putting it down in your basement.
Hmm.
That's definitely a good option. Have you noticed any swings in the fermentation temperature at all?
Actually, I haven't at all. I mean, I the temperature normally goes up once fermentation starts.
Right.
It may jump up like 2 degrees, or well, yeah, about 2 3 degrees. It may go up, and but other than that, it doesn't like spike or anything like that. Even when I use a yeast starter and the yeast are going to town, and it's churning real good, I don't get a whole lot of temperature fluctuation. So and then I think it helps that my carboy is sitting on a concrete floor. So I think that kind of helps keep things a little from going too high.
Definitely. My first one, I took the typical advice of a lot of new homebrewers and put it in a closet. And
Hmm.
that's kind of like one step below where you're at, or maybe two steps below where you're at right now. I had a old 1950s style home. It was April in South Carolina. I had a few swings up and down due to the April air in my house having no insulation, but it was a lovely house.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people like that can do is actually put the fermenter in a bucket of water or a tub. And the water, like you said with your concrete, will help to kind of nix the swings, because you've got to heat or cool the entire water before you're even touching the fermentation
I
temperature.
never thought about that because that
Yeah,
that water would probably help maintain stability because it
right.
takes, yeah, that's a good idea. Hmm.
Yeah. And then if you're in South Carolina and let's say it's July instead of April, you can even take it a step further and throw a couple of frozen, say, 2-liter uh, soda bottles in and alternate it out every 8 to 12 hours.
Hmm.
Then just make sure that, it is really 80 degrees in your house and so it's not getting too cold for your beer. But I know I needed to do that when I had to ferment some stuff last July before I had this wonderful AC unit.
So what's the temperature you try to keep most of your ales?
So, depending on I guess the broadest way to say it is 65 to 75, but each one of the yeasts will have their desired temperatures, and we'll talk more specifically about yeast next week. Right now, we're just going to kind of assume that we're all using a nice dry yeast that's in date and fresh and good to go, and we're rehydrating it. Then we're pitching it at the appropriate temperature range. Usually midway through the temperature range, I like to say probably 68 degrees, but it just depends on what yeast you're using.
Hmm.
And you don't want to do what some people do is they'll get impatient. In South Carolina in the summer, you're trying to chill your wort after brew day. You're probably not going to be able to get it much below 85 degrees. But you don't
Yeah.
want to pitch your yeast when it's 85 degrees.
So,
Doing so
and
will cause you to have a lot of diacetyl.
is
Or
that
the
the
butter
butter
pop.
flavor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the yeast will throw off a lot more diacetyl in the beginning, and then they'll slow down because the temperature is cooled down, and they won't have the time to clean all of it up before they fall out and go dormant.
So if you taste your wort and you get a I've never tasted diacetyl at all, so knock on wood. But if you get that, can you pitch more yeast and the yeast can kill the diacetyl perhaps? Or it's just a
Potentially, I
bad
guess.
batch?
I guess just a lot of times you wouldn't necessarily notice the diacetyl until you already had it racked over into your keg or your bottles.
Okay.
You
I've
might, but
I guess fortunately I've never experienced diacetyl, so but is it one of those things where when you taste it you know it?
oh yeah,
Okay.
taste and mouthfeel can
Okay.
have kind of a interesting. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily go slimy, but
Like
just
a oily.
Yeah.
yep, yeah.
Okay.
What some people say, and what you were just talking about, Randy, is that when you add the new yeast in, because usually they create that diacetyl when they're like multiplying and like right before they start going to town,
Hmm.
that what they'll do is they'll see that there's not much sugar to consume, so most of it will just fall out and not necessarily clean up anything. So that's what some people are saying about it, so it won't even make a difference whether you pitch it or not, or repitch rather.
Okay.
That's a hard
Right.
fix. Yeah, when you get to that point. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's why I
you
say
discover
after
in the end, and it's a
Hmm.
little hard.
after cleaning and sanitation, following the temperature range on the yeast is definitely the next thing you can do to improve your homebrew. Just the best thing if you don't have a nice method with a controller or a refrigerator or window unit is to just try to maintain a temperature because that'll get you most of all flavors out of the way. The fluctuation is bad, and then another thing we need to hit on is if it's too hot. I brewed a beer about a year and a half ago and put it in a closet, and it sat directly by a vent. And I wasn't thinking about it, and then it got really cold, and so the heat came on, and I had all sorts of fusel alcohols in that beer because of that. It would get hot, and then it would get cold, and then it would get hot, then it would get cold. And like over probably 80, 85 degrees, I suspect, because it was right by the vent.
Okay, so let's talk about fusel alcohols real quick. What does that taste like?
It will make your 5% milk stout taste like a 12% beer, except for even worse, like just a really strong solvent alcohol flavor.
Okay.
Yeah,
Some
it's not something you want.
some people say it feels really like sharp and prickly on like in the mouth feel versus like what a normal beer would taste like.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're pitching, do you watch the temperature depending on if you're using dry, smack pack, or you're making a little wort? Do you vary the temperature you're pitching in depending on the
No,
yeast
it
you're using?
shouldn't matter what way the yeast is packaged, just different yeast. Like my Kolsch yeast, I think it actually wanted to ferment around 60 degrees. And I think it got up to about 64 in this room because my window unit really wouldn't get it much colder. But then there's some yeast like a Saison yeast, it can go up in the 70s, 80s, 118 if who you ask. Um, yeah. So
Does dry yeast ferment differently from say like a smack pack or a white labs? I mean, is it as simple? Do you have to rehydrate it, or do you just dump it straight into your wort
it's
and let it go to work? And is there a big difference in temperature fluctuation at
it's
all?
very important to rehydrate it, yeah.
Okay.
But as far as the differences, it shouldn't be any differences. I think I've actually listened to a podcast on Basic Brewing Radio where they did like 8 different beers, all the same wort, but with different yeast, dry yeast, and a couple different liquid ones, just packaged differently, essentially the same type of yeast, and it didn't make much of a difference in that regard. There was other factors, but not that. Dry yeast have come a long way from where they used to be years ago. I never used them back then, but I've heard stories from people who've been brewing 20, 30 years that say it's significantly better than it used to be.
Okay. Because I saw a YouTube video of this guy. He has a ton of videos with him brewing, and he used dry yeast, and he just straight dumped it right in the wort, and I was like, what?
Yeah, some people do that, and I think it on some packages it tells you to do that, but it just immediately stresses the yeast from the onset, so it's not always the best thing, like making them stressed out from the beginning.
Okay.
It makes them work harder and produce more off flavors that will potentially get cleaned up as long as everything else is okay, but there's no reason to risk that.
Okay. Oh, hope I never have that diacetyl experience that others have had.
The other thing is the fruitiness, because all L yeast produces fruity characters, and the higher you ferment, the more fruitiness you're going to get. Um, One thing that I thought, and Alan and I were talking about it before the show, is that you can get phenolics.
Hmm.
And I Googled and Googled, and I even looked up in the book How to Brew, and it mentions nothing about phenolics. So I'm not sure where that myth came from, or if maybe someone's just. It does mention in How to Brew that you can get a banana-like character, which to me sort of translates to phenolics because the banana and cloves of the Hefeweizen.
Hmm.
but it doesn't say phenolic specifically anywhere. Northern Brewer's website on off flavors doesn't mention that high fermentation temperature can produce phenolics. Did you do
That's
any research, Alan?
yeah. Well, I was doing some googling and found a whole bunch of different forums where people were asking like the same question. They were like, if like, because they didn't have temperature control, so they were asking questions like, if my beer ferments too high, will it be really phenolic? And they were trying to figure out how to fix it if it did become. And most people were like, that's not really characteristic from high fermentation. You'd be more running into like fusel alcohols and like a few just other characteristics, like off flavors characteristics from just being too high, but not phenolic. Everything I found, like reading, like you said, into how to brew and the BJCP, like study guides, none that mentioned high fermentation temperature for that either.
I wonder where the myth got started.
Phenolics is that Band-Aid flavor people talk about.
Yeah, Band-Aid is the worst of it, and then certain Belgian yeast will throw off kind of phenolic, the spices and
Yeah,
banana
there's
clove
several
and
different ways it could be
yeah,
presented, like the spiciness, like pepper, or the band-aids, like you were saying, are just plasticky. There's a lot of stuff like that.
right.
Okay.
But medicinal could also be phenolic. So
Yeah, so that's one thing that I found interesting when studying for the show today. But the alcohol thing I have experienced, the fruitiness. I can't say I've ever done one where I've had maybe my first or second one probably was a little bit more excessively fruity, and then the diacetyl. I don't think I've ever had any diacetyl in my homebrew either, but I've definitely tasted some,
So
especially out in commercial
I,
brew.
I have another question for you.
Mhm.
So if you mash, like you get different, I think, different types of sugars, whether if you mash at a higher temperature or at a lower temperature, right? So um, how does this affect the yeast? Is there you get some sugars that yeast are more apt to eat, and some sugars that yeast are not as apt to eat at the two different temperature mashing temperatures?
Oh yeah, for mashing definitely. So the higher you mash, the more complex sugar chains are going to be there. There was I guess an idea specifically with Brettanomyces because I've been studying this a lot, where you wanted to mash high so that they would have more complex sugars to chew on. It's not so much a thing anymore. People have been saying that's not the case. You just use more complex grains like rye or oats. But um, some people say that they like to mash higher to get more sugars. I personally would rather, I mean, it depends on the beer, I guess. 152, 154 is usually for most styles.
Yeah, the sugar you use makes a big difference too. You know, on flavor and
Yeah, I mean,
everything.
it depends on the grain bill and the style, really. But the
mhm.
higher you mash, the more sugars you're probably going to have left over.
So
And
how,
Saccharomyces isn't going to eat all those sugars.
so mashing higher should give you a little bit more body, and
Yes,
and
that's
mashing lower will give you a
possible.
drier beer.
Yeah, definitely drier, a lot drier when you mash lower.
Okay.
I think that's what
So
you're getting into next month, or am I wrong in that?
Next week or next month, we are going to talk about the yeast specifically and how important it is to have good, healthy yeast and what you can do to make yourself have good, healthy yeast after you buy it at the store. And then the wort and what sort of things the yeast would like to chew on and how you can make your wort the best for the yeast, the best environment. Yeah. So I guess make sure we hit all of our points. We talked about all the different ways that you can control your fermentation and why you need to. I guess we can mash out. Are there any other questions that relate to this or don't relate to this?
nope, not for me. I think I'm good. This is this is good.
Yeah.
Yeah, trying to think of. I mean, because covering ale, so I'm just trying to think of. Because I mean, I've seen different ways people ferment it, like the towel method you talked about earlier, and like the water bucket. Some people do it in a freezer, and some people just do it in a closet. So I'm trying to think of other potential. situations we might find ourselves in, how to better control it.
Right. Definitely don't put it under your house, like foundation, outside. That may
I,
sound like a good idea, but it's probably not.
I read a board one time, and a guy was saying, I can't remember exactly what he said, but I think he said that his fermentation was stuck, and somebody suggested that he like bumped the carboy a little bit, and like when he bumped it, it kind of started the fermentation all over again. Is that a thing, or am I recalling wrong?
Um, the
Maybe he
only thing
had
I can
no
imagine
Or,
with that
or,
is
or maybe his crossin was stuck at the top or something like that, and when he bumped it, everything just kind of started falling.
maybe bumping it to get more oxygen in it. I don't
The
Okay.
only,
know.
the only thing I could think of is just kind of going based on your situation, what you said was there anyway. If it was stuck, maybe someone suggested like rousing the yeast because it probably dropped out because it was too cold. So
Yeah.
they might have been trying to get it back into suspension to finish the fermentation. But if they didn't raise the temperature also, then I mean, bringing it up might
Right.
get
Bump
the
up
yeast
the
up.
temperature. I could see that.
Yeah.
I've
Okay.
actually heard people say bump up the temperature,
Hmm.
but not
Because
actually.
I find weird that the crowds would hold, anything. Eventually, that thing would come up, unless it was in the very beginning.
Well, a lot of what that is just different proteins and like dead yeast cells and stuff like that. So
I do have a question though. What are the aspects you run to when you still have fermentation on a secondary? Do you
Oh,
just go to the
secondary.
same thing? Yeah, because I had my last beer. I move it, dumb knucklehead, move it into the secondary, and then I put the lock back on, the valve back on, and then I see that thing keep flopping up, and I realized, oh, maybe I should have waited a little longer.
How long did you wait?
It was a week and a half before I move it. I want to bright it. Yeah, I was rushing things because we were doing that IPA thing that never happened.
Was it a high ABV beer?
Um, I think I end at 7 something. Yeah.
Are you talking about the Imperial IPA
Yeah,
brew off we're supposed to have?
right. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know. I think if I transferred to secondary and mine started bubbling again, I might be concerned that I had some kind of wild yeast or something.
well, with the time you set it, or you mentioned like about 10 days ish, it might have just been like excess gas that wasn't out of suspension when you racked it over. Because usually depending on what temperature you fermented at, but usually at 10 days, that's like if I'm a dry hop or add fruit. It also depends on the beer, but like with the pale ale, let's say I'm gonna dry hop it at 10 days when I'll do it, and I'll still get some activity in the airlock, but it's not like active fermentation. It's just gas being like blown off at that point.
Yes. Gil, was it like a
Reasonable.
was it like
Yeah,
a
no, it was bubbling. It was still, you know, I
Hmm.
was
oh
very
wow.
surprised. I was very surprised, and
What temperature did you
I
ferment
don't
it
know.
at? Do you remember?
It may be because I had fruit on it. I still had sugar, but I
Yeah.
was not hoping to have the yeast still active like that.
Yeah, I guess
What?
if you put fruit in there, I could see it eating on the sugar again and causing a little bit of fermentation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one.
That's reasonable.
He woke the yeast back up with that food you put in there.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
never put fruit. Somebody told me that if you freeze the fruit, that would be enough to kill all the germs, and I learned
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
hard way,
that's
but
the
it
typical way of
didn't.
doing it.
Yeah, but it didn't. I have an infection because of the fruit that I had in there.
On which beer?
When I did the peach, my peach wheat,
Hmm.
yeah, it was I only froze the fruit and then I put it in there and then it was infected. I mean, it could be something that I did when I was
Yeah.
moving.
Well,
That's
you had a bunch of fresh peaches though, so you caught everything that was on those peaches from outside, and in the process of peeling, or you probably just couldn't kill everything if you
hmm
didn't freeze it to like 20 degrees. If you froze it to probably just like regular freezer temperature, then you probably didn't get cold enough to kill everything that was wild on the peaches. I'm guessing,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I don't know.
it's
It's
some,
my understanding that if you freeze it, you're good.
Yeah,
yeah.
because that's one of the most common ways people say either freeze it or to like make a heat water up and mash it in like the hot water. But like there's give and take for both methods, but freezing should have been, I think, fine.
I may brew the same beer all over again and go for the steps and see. I may catch what I did wrong. Just things that happens to me that I just like,
Oh, we
right.
all have our stories.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's part of learning. That's the fun of it.
Yep.
Well, cool. So make sure that you keep your beer cool. The range suggested on the packet. And if you can't maintain your fermentation temperature, then your beer may be a little off.
Off.
Yeah,
Not necessarily bad in every situation, just
yeah.
And those thermometers and
maybe not what you
stickers are
wanted.
so
Just
cheap.
do the
I mean,
best you can to maintain your fermentation temperature. And post a blog in the next couple of days that goes over it in a little bit more detail. But hopefully all your questions have been answered. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the YouTube or the Google Plus Hangout, or the Hangout in the event. Yeah, that one. And yeah, it's been fun. I guess we'll
Twitter
sign off
too.
tonight.
Tweet your questions as
yeah.
well
Yes, you can
at
tweet your questions.
CBN.
Sure.
Are we all gonna
Crappy.
brew a beer in the end of those shows every
We'll,
year?
we'll eventually get around to some brewing, I think. I think that there may be some brewing at a certain convention that comes up later in the year. Yeah, it'd be fun.
Cool.
So it's been fun tonight, and again, don't forget to find us on craftbeernation.org. Look us up on YouTube, follow us, Stitcher, iTunes, Podcatcher, and Feedburner to listen to the podcast. Google Plus Community, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to follow all of our fun beer shenanigans. And with that, I think we will mash out. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.